This is Philosophy 6, Introduction to Logic at Las Positas College. We're covering Chapter 3.3, Fallacies of Weak Induction from the Hurley Logic textbook. So a fallacy of weak induction is just a fallacy where a speaker does give evidence for some claim, but treats that evidence as strong evidence that it is sufficient to establish the claim, when in reality, all the speaker has given is weak evidence. There are several kinds that we will be covering today. The first example given by Hurley is the appeal to authority. So the appeal to authority occurs when an unqualified authority is offered as evidence for a claim. Here's an example. I conclude that I should not study philosophy because my eye doctor said you will find philosophy boring and be unable to get a job. One thing that we frequently see in appeals to false authority is just that people who really are authorities, for example, doctors, we might take them to be authorities over things like career planning, which a doctor in this case would not be. The next fallacy covered by Hurley is the appeal to ignorance. An appeal to ignorance is committed any time we use a lack of evidence to conclude that some claim is either true or false. Here's two sort of opposing examples here. God's existence has not been disproven after all these years, so it must be true. Or God's existence has not been proven after all these years, so it must not be true. The basic point here is just that a lack of evidence for something is not in itself evidence for or against a claim. Now there may be cases when a lack of evidence is in fact evidence for a claim. For example, if we've set up an experiment and everything about the nature of the experiment suggests that if a claim were true, we would get the evidence through this experiment. Another example given by Hurley is the example of a court, because in the case of an American court, you're considered innocent until proven guilty. So to say you're innocent in the legal sense really just means there isn't enough evidence to convict you. And so in this case, a lack of evidence does support a positive claim of innocence. A hasty generalization is whenever we apply a conclusion to a group from an insufficient sample. Here's a real example that came from class a few years ago. A student had visited a country and said, in that country, almost everyone is a beggar. I said, well, no, that's not true. Why would you think so? And he said, it is true. I've been there. And whenever I went around, everyone who was around asked me for money. So you can see why the student might be led to the conclusion that everyone in this country was a beggar, because the people who came around him were interested in obtaining money, but that wasn't good evidence that this was the primary form of economy for the country as a whole. Now Hurley is going to talk about three versions of false cause, but the essential element of what makes false cause is just that we're attempting to establish a claim using an improbable or unfounded causal connection. The first example I'll cover here is post hoc ergo propter hoc. This just means after, therefore, because. It's when we conclude that something caused something else just because it preceded it in time. I had a friend who was convinced that if he drank Jack Daniels every time he started to feel sick, then he would start feeling better within a few days. First he drank the Jack Daniels, and then within a few days he was feeling better. The reason this is insufficient evidence that the Jack Daniels caused him to feel better is because, as your doctor will tell you, with most cases of illness, you'll start feeling better within a short time anyway. Oversimplified cause is another form of false cause, and this is when a certain effect has many causes, but an arguer acts as if there is only a single cause. Here's an example that might be a bit self-serving. A student says, I'm failing that class because the teacher is too strict. Now on the surface of it, this does make at least some sense. The approach of the teacher will have some effect on the success or failure of the student. But most of the times I've heard this, I would consider it to be an oversimplified cause, primarily because that's not the only reason that this student is likely to be failing. Another example given by Hurley is non causa pro causa. You can think of this as identifying a cause that is not really a cause when it's based on something besides temporal succession. Temporal succession is just post hoc ergo propter hoc. But oftentimes a false cause can be identified that is not really a case of temporal succession like that. So here's an example. Executives of top companies are paid millions of dollars a year, so the best way to make our startup successful is to pay our managers millions of dollars a year. Now, we don't have temporal succession in this case. We have two things going on at the same time. It's an example of false cause because really the temporal succession should be thought of in the opposite direction. In other words, for the most part, it's the fact that the companies are radically successful that allows them to pay their executives millions of dollars. In the case of a startup company, it wouldn't make sense to work things the other way around. The gambler's fallacy is a special type of false cause fallacy where we predict patterns in phenomena that are known to be random. So for example, if someone said, I won bingo 3 nights in a row, so I'm probably going to win again tonight. Or if someone said the reverse, I lost bingo 3 nights in a row, so I'm probably due for a win tonight. In both cases, bingo is designed to have a random outcome. It's built into the system. And so something like a winning streak or a losing streak doesn't actually change the basic probability that is built into the game, even though it might start to feel psychologically like we're due for a win or we're on a winning streak and that's likely to continue. The slippery slope fallacy is another kind of false cause fallacy where someone claims that a move in one direction will result in an exaggerated causal chain, but in reality the links in that chain are improbable and only loosely related. Here's an example. Someone says, if we allow gay marriage, soon people will be marrying cars. Or someone else says, if we don't allow gay marriage, pretty soon people will be arrested and jailed just for being gay. Now luckily the Supreme Court has answered the question of the legality of marriage since this time. But what's wrong with both of these arguments is that they just go too far in making an assumption that if we make a move in a certain direction, it will cause a series of cascading effects that results in very dramatic and probabilistically unlikely outcomes. The next example of a fallacy of weak induction given by Hurley is the weak analogy. We're guilty of a weak analogy whenever we compare two things that are dissimilar in ways that makes the comparison ineffective. Imagine someone says that Joe Biden, he wants to take away your freedom just like Hitler, so he must be stopped. Or Donald Trump wants direct control over the government, just like Mussolini, so he must be stopped. Now it is important that we learn from history, but in general comparing things like American presidents to genocidal dictators doesn't really add much to the argument. It's better to just focus on the facts of the candidates themselves and to use that as evidence for why they should or should not be supported as candidates. Now that concludes all of the fallacies from chapter 3.3 in the Hurley. I did want to talk about one more from chapter 3.4, just because it's one that during election time we see so frequently. So I'm going to put this one out there and you can feel free to use it in your assignment as well. It's called false dichotomy, and a false dichotomy is committed whenever we limit the possible conclusions of an argument to only two, when in reality there are more. It could be a false dichotomy that has 3 options. You can call it a false trichotomy. So here's an example. Someone says to their partner, will you sleep with me or do you not really love me? Hopefully the partner is clever enough to see that these should not be the only 2 options put forward, that in reality there are many other options besides these that should be available in a mature and mutually respecting relationship. In the case of a political election season, you might well see a candidate say, are you going to elect me or are you a communist anarchist? Or maybe, are you going to elect me or do you support fascist dictators? The reality, of course, is that there are often many more options than the ones being given by the politician, but creating a simple choice that forces you to choose among something you might not like relative to something you know you don't want can create a false sense that you have no choice but to support the speaker's platform. I hope this overview is helpful in orienting you to the fallacies that we cover this week from section 3.3. Be sure to read the textbook and go through the Learning Logic tutorials as well. Have a good week.